Hi folks, welcome to another episode of the Dr. Meade Show. Today, my guest again is Dr. Eric Lebby, Chief of Orthopedics at Lehigh Valley Health Network. Today we have a show that we've been waiting for a long time. We've been waiting to discuss nutraceuticals, supplements that we use in our practice for our orthopedic patients that helps deal with inflammation, pain, surgical preparation, and recovery. Because there are so many nutraceuticals that we actually use, we have to limit it to perhaps our favorite one. Today we're going to talk the whole show, perhaps two shows, on fish oil or omega-3. Before I introduce Dr. Levy, I want to put up a disclaimer. This presentation is for informational and educational purposes only. It's not intended to substitute for any medical advice. What you hear today is just our personal opinion. It does not necessarily reflect the views of Coordinated Health or Lehigh Valley Health Network. Please seek the advice of your physician for any medical advice to deal with supplements or prescriptions. I'm going to try to hit the history of omega-3, how Dr. Lebby started with his omega prescriptions in his practice. I'm going to go over the science, the government involvement, the FDA history, big pharmaceuticals interest in fish oil, controversies, misconceptions, and dosages. I want to start with a few facts. Actually, three quarters of adults in this country are on supplements. And arthritic patients, which is what we treat, are more likely than any other patients to use supplements and herbal remedies. Patients are often more knowledgeable than our colleagues and our referring doctors. The amount of money spent on supplements every year is $30 billion. If you add herbal products, it's $40 million, but that's dwarfed by the pharmaceutical industry by a factor of 10, $360 billion per year. The growth of dietary supplements over the last decade has been phenomenal. You can see on this slide that 3/4 of Americans are using supplements. Why is that? Well, because they're tired of the cost of drugs, the unpredictable and dangerous side effects, chronic diseases treated with prescription drugs with poor therapeutic alternatives. They desire personalized medicine. They want to stave off the effect of aging. They want to focus on preventative medicine. And there's this perception that natural is good. But why is your doctor more likely to prescribe drugs than supplements? I think before we get into this talk today, you really have to understand that. And you have to understand that our healthcare system, where we were trained, is based on the pharmaceutical model. 70% of our patients are on one prescription, 50% are on two, and frankly, in our joint replacement world, Dr. Lebby, I would bet that most of our patients are more on 5 or 10 prescription drugs than 1 or 2.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with Tom. And first of all, thank you very much for having me back on your show. I'm looking forward to this topic that we're talking about today because, you know, most physicians don't talk about this stuff. And we weren't taught in medical school. I know we'll get into it today, but we really weren't taught this in medical school. And you and I understand that we're not just orthopedic surgeons. We might be the patient's only doctor. We might be their only physician that they see. So we have to really care not just for the hip or the knee, we have to really care for the patient's entire body.
I agree. And we're going to talk about how we were criticized. When we started recommending supplements like omega-3 or fish oils, we were laughed at by our colleagues, and I'll go over that. Let me go over the history. I think this is fascinating. But first I want to note a study out of the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard notes that prescription drugs are a major health risk. I don't know if a lot of people know that, ranking 4th with stroke as a leading cause of death. So there is no free lunch when it comes to prescription drugs.
Do you know what though, Tom, too? And another interesting fact is, do you know the number 8 killer in America?
No.
Omega-3 deficiency.
Is it really?
Yeah, over 96,000 deaths a year are from omega-3 deficiency.
Wow.
That's a big number.
Yeah.
You wouldn't think that.
Omega-anemia. We'll talk about that a little later. Let me just really quickly go back you have to go back to the early 1900s, 1800s actually, to realize why physicians are more likely to prescribe drugs than supplement. It was the wild, wild west back there. There were all kind of practitioners. There was osteopaths, naturopaths, homeopaths, herbal medicine, chiropractors, nutrition. But you know what was interesting about most of those providers? It was safe and effective treatment. You know what was the dangerous, often lethal medicine? The orthodox medicine, which is really what became allopathic medicine. What they were doing was dangerous, it was ineffective. They used heavy metals like mercury, arsenic, lead, bloodletting, purging, leaching, blistering, surgery with often unpleasant and lethal side effects. Terrible. Enter J.D. Rockefeller. We always thought he was an oil baron, but let me tell you, he was into the drug industry, as was his father, Bill Rockefeller. In the late 1800s, he used coal tar and opium as a cancer cure. But he looked at this as an opportunity, but he had to control medical education. He needed a vehicle to extend and capitalize on his petroleum-based drugs and medicines. So you know what he did? He hired Flexner. He was an educator to go around the country and look at medical schools and look at physicians. He generated a report that basically said there were too many doctors, too many medical schools, and they're all quackery. The only ones that weren't quackery were the allopath or the orthodox medicine. They presented this to Congress. It became law. So thus, Rockefeller controlled allopathic medicine under the proviso that all curriculum in these schools was dismantled to remove any mention of herbs, plants, food, and nutrition as helping human health. So he was then assured that a pharmaceutical-based medical school industry would begin. So this goes back to the early 1900s. So he also controlled the AMA, which was weak and fledgling. It didn't have much money at the time. They abolished all other medicinal therapies. They enforced licensing of doctors that now would be controlled by the Rockefeller empire. So he had a drug empire with 68 subsidiaries that were maintained under an umbrella with the Rockefeller-owned bank, Chase Manhattan, called the Drug Trust. And there was a government bureau that oversaw that. It was used to crack down on anybody that endangered the profits of the drug trust. And that bureau today is known as the FDA. One of our own, I'll tell you a funny story, Eric. Dr. Adolf Hohense from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He was called a vitaminologist.
Local guy.
Local guy, vitaminologist. I never knew there was something in the 40s. But he was actually a good doc. He sold vitamins such as vitamin B, wheat, germ oil, stating that the soil back then was even depleted of nutrients and foods were overprocessed. You know what happened? The FDA prosecuted him for misbranding based on the testimony of 10 of our best AMA doctors. Claimed in the 40s vitamins are not necessary for the human body and that dietary deficiency diseases did not exist. They've been eradicated in America with fortified foods. He was fined almost $2,000, the equivalent of close to $25,000. Let's fast forward, 1989. Really, after I just about started in practice, the term nutraceutical developed, nutrition plus pharmaceutical. It was a food or part of a food that provides medical or health benefits, including the prevention or treatment of disease. The government had a different idea. In 1994, under pressure from the food industry that they were going to disallow supplements on the public market, they came up with the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, DSHEA, and this statement to this day is on every supplement, including fish oil. That this statement has not been evaluated by the FDA. The product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Why is this? Because the FDA task force wanted to ensure the presence of dietary supplements on the market did not act as a disincentive to drug development. Now, we can make statements that say a supplement enhances the immune system, it helps the musculoskeletal system, but you can't say that it diagnoses, treats, or cure the disease, which is appropriate unless a study is performed. We tell our patients, and I'll show it on a slide here, that beware. The problem with supplements is even though they fall under the umbrella of the FDA, they are not as stringently tested or overseen as pharmaceutical products are. So buyer beware. Thus, there are unscrupulous supplement developers and suppliers that don't have quality material. They don't have quality products. It's not tested. They could sell it. And so you don't know what you're buying in the drugstore, in the grocery store is safe.
And the problem with that, Tom, too, is that you, exactly what you said, you don't know what you're getting. So what we see, a lot of our patients come to us and say, oh, I tried fish oil before. I tried the omega-3 stuff, and it was horrible. It didn't agree with me. It tasted terrible. I had fish burps. I had indigestion. I had heartburn. And most of the time you have to sit down with them and say, well, what were you taking? You know, what product were you taking? Well, it was just a big bucket, and it cost me $5.99. Oh, well, that's interesting and nice, but again, it doesn't have to be overseen. And when you're purchasing a nutraceutical, you need to make sure that it's third-party investigated. The supplements that I recommend have a third-party toxicology lab, one of the best in the world, that look for over 250 contaminants. And that's the kind of money that has to be spent to make the pharmaceutical worth your while. Instead of the marketing that a lot of these, essentially grifters will spend on marketing, get the pharmaceutical at eye level, put a nice pretty label, have a nice good-looking sponsor, and they don't spend money where it needs to be on the research of the pharmaceutical and the quality of the pharmaceutical.
It cuts right into their profits.
Exactly.
So the cheaper companies will not have that. So you have to look for these third-party testing stamps, good manufacturing products, NSF, consumer labs, those sorts of things. So you can do all that work, or you can listen to Dr. Lebby or myself that has done that work and will recommend only those supplements that have been third-party tested. Let me touch base on what the big pharmaceutical companies, their business model is most of the drugs are not de novo drugs. They're derived from plant compounds. Nature can't be patented and sold, and so pharmaceutical companies aren't interested really in natural causes. It's called biopiracy. They research natural compounds, they copy them, modify them in a lab, and then patent them. And then simultaneously will suppress or criticize the original plant as being worthless, so you won't go to the source of the cure. And you'll see that with fish oil later on in the program. I'm going to finish up by saying we've come full circle 100 years later. Another billionaire is turning the tide on alternative medicine and supplements with the largest gift ever given to a medical school at UC Irving, $200 million to invest in alternative medicine, supplements, but to do it the right way, using this money for scientific research, doing prospective randomized study, and just as you would guess, the medical establishment from Yale, John Hopkins said, this is crazy. This line shouldn't be crossed. Doctors should avoid medical schools where integrative medicine courses are required. If you want to use your time productively, don't take classes here. Well, it took 100 years, but it's almost the same thing that happened 100 years ago when J.D. Rockefeller took over allopathic medicine. So when we come back, I'm going to have Dr. Eric Lebby tell us how he got involved with omega-3 supplements. Stay with us. Folks, welcome back to our show. My guest is Dr. Eric Lebby, Chief of Orthopedics at Lehigh Valley Hospital, and a show completely dedicated to omega-3. First half of our show was important. It was important to give a history on why doctors prescribe more pharmaceuticals than nutraceuticals. So we left, and I'm going to have Dr. Lebby sort of tell us his story about how he got involved with using omega-3s in his orthopedic practice. Eric?
Sure, Tom. So, I bumped into omega-3s really on my own. I had a problem when I was here for about a year or two in the Valley, and I had a problem with irregular heartbeat, and I actually had to get admitted. I had something called atrial fibrillation. And I had to get admitted to the hospital, and I had to get cardioverted, where they give you that shock. And after that, a friend of mine, who was actually at the time someone who worked with me with joints, joint replacements said, try this stuff. And I looked at it, I'm like, in medical school, we're not taught that stuff. We're not taught about omega-3s. We're not taught about nutraceuticals. We're taught what Tom told you earlier in the show. We have to prescribe medicines. We have to fix things, prescribe medicines. The supplements, they don't work. So I did a lot of investigating, and I read about it, and I read studies, and there are tons of studies, Tom, that we'll get into throughout this segment on the positives of omega-3s. So that's where I started taking an omega-3, and I also started taking some other nutraceuticals, and found that, all the things that I was told about my irregular heartbeat and it could come back later, I had listened, avoided all the stimulants like coffee, and any tobacco products or alcohol. But taking these supplements, I found they really helped me. And they made me feel better. I'm big into exercise. Suddenly I found myself being able to exercise better. My exercise tolerance increased. And I said, well, if this is working for me, why don't I do this with my patients? Why don't I say, hey, think about this omega-3 and how important it is for your health, how important it is for not just your bone health and your musculoskeletal health, but your brain health, your heart health, your cholesterol health, your issues with diabetes, your issues with memory. There are so many benefits to omega-3s. So this was about 15 years ago, and I do a weekend show. You've done plenty of shows, a local show where we are in Allentown, and we were talking about these omega-3s, and then all of a sudden, food companies started coming out with DHA and EPA fortified milk, DHA and EPA fortified formulas and baby food, and all of a sudden this influx of information came, and I think that it's so important that we spread this word, because if we don't, I worry that a lot of patients are going to get left out when it comes to omega-3s.
I love that history. What's fascinating about that history is that omega-3s affect every cell in the body, every organ in the body. So it's not just cardiology or orthopedics or your neurology. They're all related. But we sort of learned, and we'll look at some of the basic science, but we won't complicate it too much. But you're absolutely right. Of the two ingredients in fish oil, it's the DHA which really helps with electrical stabilization of your heart. Who would have thought that? And we've known this. The funny part is we've known this, for a long time on studies, but the medical profession, thought it was malarkey. Over in Europe, they were sort of ahead of us in this regard. But I like you, came at it for a different reason, which I'll get into. But I've had athletic arrhythmias off and on in my life from, being too tired, too fatigued, too much caffeine, not enough sleep, and stress, and you get some arrhythmias. And I've been worked up for the same thing, and I've committed to omega-3s since that period of time. My history was a little different. In 2004, I thought that we were misled by the pharmaceutical companies because, my practice was pretty busy by that time. I'd been in practice for 13 or 14 years, and our anti-inflammatories are a mainstay, of our treatment. And all of a sudden, some of the safer anti-inflammatories, supposedly the COX-2 inhibitors came out, Bextra and Vioxx. My patients loved them. Their stomach didn't bother them.
They never felt better.
They never felt better.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden there was some bad press that came out, and they took Bextra off the market, and they said, there may be a little problem here. Well, we didn't.
Vioxx was first.
That's right. Vioxx came off first.
Bextra voluntarily
took it off.
Took them. Yeah.
Yeah,
Merck, and then it was Pfizer.
And you're absolutely right. A historian.
My wife happens to be a pharmaceutical rep.
Oh, is she really?
That's how we met. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So she was a Pfizer rep. So I know
know
all about the NSAIDs and the COX-2s.
Oh no, it's absolutely true. It just fascinates me that they knew that for 5 years, that there was an increased risk of heart attacks, strokes, clotting, etc. So anyway, when they took them off the market, I felt we were left high and dry, and they took off Vioxx, as you said, then Bextra, and I said, well, the next one's going to come off as the next COX-2 inhibitor, but instead we did some research, and like you, I found out that fish oil was used for 2 centuries in arthritic patients. These old practitioners, it was safe, it was effective, it went back to the late 1700s. the rheumatologists were using it for lupus and rheumatoid. So we started using. My patients loved it. But that's the quick history, of how I started using it, and we never went back. And some interesting facts is that fish oil or omega-3s are called essential fatty acid. That means we don't make them and we die without them. So unless we eat them, which the main source is fish, we're going to die. That was not recognized when I was in medical school. So we didn't even know that. It's amazing what we didn't know. So now there's a black box warning. Very few people read it. But if you take Advil, if you take Aleve, if you take any anti-inflammatories, there's a lethal warning that this can cause heart attack, stroke, clotting, which may be fatal, or you can bleed to death, perforate your ulcer, or perforate your stomach and have an ulcer, etc. Nor do they know there's an increased risk of high blood pressure or liver
and also,
injury.
the other issue is side effects with other medications. In combination, you mentioned earlier that a lot of our patients take multiple medications. If you're on multiple medications and you add an NSAID, it can be dangerous. So the thing about the NSAIDs, they work. They work incredibly well. And a lot of people out there don't understand that they're medication. Right? So people think that, I say to them, what medications are you on? They list their blood pressure meds, they list their cholesterol med, they list other meds, and I say, well, what are you taking for pain? Oh, I take Advil, or I take Aleve, or I take Tylenol. Well, you understand that is a medication. Oh, no, well, yeah. And because they don't think it's a medication, they think more is better. Right? So if the bottle says take 4, but it makes me feel so good, why don't I take 6 or 8? A couple times a day. And the problem with the NSAIDs is they work so very well. But the problem with the NSAIDs is they have what I like to call collateral damage, right? There are side effects, like you mentioned, high blood pressure, swelling of the lower extremities, gastric ulcers, gastric irritation. There's even a statistic, a death from NSAIDs. And the funny thing is, what we mentioned is the omega-3s are the best natural anti-inflammatory out there. Guess what? They don't have the collateral damage that you get with the NSAIDs. And that's what makes them so special.
You mentioned Pfizer, and the CEO of Pfizer at the time in 2005 was Hank McKinnell, and he said, well, this was right in the sort of mix of this crisis, and he said, any drug, there's no free lunch, any drug powerful enough to do good can also do some harm. And I immediately thought of fish oil, and I said, fish oil is powerful enough to do tremendous good, and it does no harm. It's the perfect natural drug, if you will. And to that point, a lot of people sort of use fish oil and omega-3 interchangeably, and that's not exactly the same. And so there is a difference between fish oil and omega-3.
Sure. So fish oil is really where we talk about the EPA and the DHA. That's from fish, right? The amount that we have to eat or consume of the EPA and DHA is a great deal. Now, there is one population that did this, and this is a very interesting study. Years ago, they looked at an Eskimo population. And curiously, they found that this Eskimo population had absolutely no heart disease. It was non-existent because all they ate was fatty fish, right? So if you live near the coast, if you're on the west side, the east side, or the southern side, and you're up by the coast, you can eat a lot of fish. Fish is good and it's fresh. Here in Allentown and Scranton, I don't see any big, huge bodies of water around us. And, even they call it fresh, it's really like fresh frozen, and it's not really fresh. So that's why a lot of people just don't eat fish, because it's hard to eat quality, good fish if you're not living near the coast. So we don't get enough. So can you get omega-3s from vegetables and plants? And the answer is yes. And that really comes in the form of alpha lipoic acid. And it is an omega-3. But even eating all the vegetables and leafy greens that you can and fish, you're still not going to really be able to get enough of the omega-3s throughout the day, every day of the week. It's like you said, it is essential. They are essential. Our body makes small amounts of omega-3s, but not nearly enough for us to survive on. And I always tell my patients, just think about it from the cellular level. Our cell membranes contain and are made of omega-3s, right down to the cellular level. So, that's how important they are.
So yeah, I absolutely agree. And somewhere I read where the plant-based omega-3s. They're good for you, but the conversion to EPA and DHA is somewhere in the 10 to 15% range. Right. So you certainly don't get that. It's not bad for you. But a lot of people will say, well, geez, I'm allergic to fish. And I really push that point because it sounds crazy, but fish oil doesn't really come from fish. That sounds crazy. But really, fish are the factories that concentrate it. It actually comes from plants. It comes from algae that the fish eat, and then we extract and purify the EPA and DHA. So frankly, the high quality purified EPA and DHA has no fish products in it.
But what you said is key, is the high quality, and
Yes.
that's where people get into trouble, is when they don't investigate and they don't read what's really behind that label. Because if you don't, you're not sure what you're getting, and you're getting those toxins. You're getting the actual fish product, not the purified EPA and DHA, which is really what we need.
And it's, not to get too chemical, but we use these terms EPA and DHA, and I think it's important to sort of know the difference. On a very simplistic basis, we sort of touch base on it, where the DHA is more for brain function, visual for your eyes, arrhythmias in your heart. It's the speed fatty acids, things that happen quickly in sperm, hummingbirds. They have a lot of DHA, whereas the EPA is more of the anti-inflammatory. But you need both working synergistically. And the pharmaceutical companies, we'll see a little later, picked one out,
right,
and they say how great it is. But just think if you use two of them together in its natural manner.
And the funny is they've looked at separate studies, Tom, and they've looked at DHA and EPA and found that they work best in combination.
So time went so quickly, I can't believe it. We've only gone through a minuscule amount of data. So let's do a second show and continue.
I look forward to it, Tom.
Great. Stay with us and tune in for part 2.